The morning sun cast long shadows across the palace gardens as Catherine gathered the last of her personal belongings from the bedroom she had called home for over a decade. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded the children's drawings that had been pinned to her private bulletin board. Each colorful crayon mark told a story of bedtime giggles, scraped knees kissed better, and quiet moments stolen between royal duties. William stood by the window, his usually composed demeanor cracking as he watched the groundskeepers tend to the roses his grandmother had planted years ago. The weight of their decision pressed down on his shoulders like a heavy winter coat he couldn't remove. 3 sleepless nights had led to this moment, and still the words felt impossible to speak aloud. The children had been told they were going on an extended holiday to their country home. George, now old enough to sense the tension in adult conversations, had asked pointed questions that neither parent felt ready to answer. Charlotte clutched her favorite stuffed rabbit closer than usual, while Louis remained blissfully unaware that this particular morning would reshape their entire world. Palace staff moved through the corridors with unusual quietness, as if sensing that something monumental was shifting beneath the surface of routine. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who had served the family for 8 years, kept finding excuses to dust already spotless surfaces near the family's private quarters. Her knowing glances spoke volumes about the rumors that had been circulating among the staff for weeks. Catherine's sister Pippa had arrived early that morning, her eyes red from crying during the drive from London. She helped pack boxes in silence, occasionally stopping to embrace her sister when the emotions became too overwhelming. The 2 women had shared everything since childhood, but this departure felt different from any other challenge they had faced together. The official statement had been drafted and redrafted 17 times. Each version felt either too revealing or too vague. How do you explain to a nation that has followed your love story for decades that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the crushing weight of expectation and duty? How do you tell people who see you as a fairy tale that even fairy tales can have chapters that don't end with happiness? William's private secretary knocked softly on the door, reminding them that the car would arrive in 30 minutes. The timing had been carefully coordinated to avoid the usual morning rush of photographers who gathered outside the palace gates. Even their departure had to be managed like a state event, with security protocols and media strategies that turned their most personal moment into another piece of royal choreography. As Catherine zipped the last suitcase, she found herself staring at their wedding photo on the dresser. The young couple in the picture seemed like strangers now, their faces bright with the optimism that comes before life teaches you its hardest lessons. She wrapped the frame in tissue paper, uncertain whether she was preserving a memory or burying it. The sound of children's laughter drifted up from the garden below, where George and Charlotte were playing with their security detail's children. During what they believed was just another ordinary morning, their innocence felt both precious and heartbreaking, a reminder of what was being protected and what was being sacrificed in equal measure. William joined Catherine by the dresser, his hand finding hers in a gesture that had become automatic after years of presenting a united front to the world. But today, their clasped hands felt like an anchor rather than a comfort, weighing them down instead of holding them steady. The silence between them held more conversations than they had actually spoken in recent months. Outside, the first drops of an unexpected rain shower began tapping against the windows, as if the sky itself was acknowledging the sadness of their departure. Catherine watched the water streak down the glass and wondered if this was what closure looked like, or if they were simply trading one kind of prison for another. The uncertainty felt both terrifying and strangely liberating, like stepping off a cliff without knowing if they could fly. The black sedan pulled through the palace gates for what everyone knew would be the last time, though the children continued their animated discussion about weekend plans, completely unaware that their weekend would stretch indefinitely into an uncertain future. Catherine kept her sunglasses on despite the overcast morning, not because of the paparazzi they had successfully avoided, but because her tears had been falling steadily since they left their bedroom. William gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary as they drove through the London streets he had known since childhood. Every landmark they passed felt like a page being torn from their story. The park where they had taken their first official photos as an engaged couple, the restaurant where they had celebrated Charlotte's first steps, the bookstore where Catherine used to escape when the pressure became too suffocating. At a red light, an elderly woman walking her dog glanced into their car and did a double-take. For a moment, William considered rolling down the window and waving, maintaining the facade, that everything was normal. Instead, he looked straight ahead until the light turned green, leaving the confused woman staring at their departing car with a puzzled expression. The children's excitement about their holiday began to fade as the drive stretched longer than their usual trips to the country house. George, always the most perceptive, noticed that they had passed the familiar turnoff to their weekend retreat. "Daddy, where are we actually going?" he asked, his voice carrying the first hint of worry that made Catherine's heart break a little. "More." "Somewhere new, darling," William replied, catching Catherine's eye in the rearview mirror. They had rehearsed this conversation, but the words still felt foreign in his mouth. "Somewhere we can have adventures without quite so many people watching us all the time." Charlotte perked up at the mention of adventures, but Louis had fallen, asleep against his car seat, his small hand still clutching the toy plane he had been flying around the back seat. His peaceful expression was a stark contrast to the tension that filled the car like an invisible passenger none of them could ignore. The first stop was a service station 2 hours outside of London, chosen specifically because it was unremarkable and unlikely to be frequented by anyone who might recognize them. William pulled his baseball cap low over his eyes, while Catherine shepherded the children to the restroom, both of them moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had spent years avoiding unwanted attention. Inside the convenience store, Charlotte marveled at the candy selection with the wonder of a child who had never been allowed to choose her own sweets from a gas station shelf. Catherine found herself smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks, as she watched her daughter debate between chocolate bars with the seriousness of a diplomat negotiating a treaty. A teenage clerk looked up from his phone and stared at William for a long moment before shaking his head and returning to his screen. The moment of non-recognition felt like a small victory, a glimpse of the anonymity they were seeking. William bought coffee that tasted nothing like the carefully prepared blends served at the palace, and somehow that bitter, ordinary taste felt like freedom. Back in the car, George had begun asking more specific questions about their destination, their belongings, and when they would be returning to their real home. Each question was a small knife twist, reminding both parents that their children would soon need to understand that some changes in life are permanent, even when they come from love rather than anger. The landscape outside their windows gradually shifted from the manicured suburbs of London to the wilder countryside of northern England. Catherine watched farms and villages blur past, each mile taking them further from the life they had known and closer to something undefined and uncertain. The GPS estimated another 4 hours to their destination, but it couldn't calculate the emotional distance they were traveling. As afternoon settled into evening, they stopped for dinner at a family pub that specialized in hearty meals and minded its own business. The children ran around the beer garden while William and Catherine sat in comfortable silence for the first time in months, both of them beginning to understand that sometimes the heaviest goodbyes happen not with words, but with the simple act of driving away from everything you used to be. The waitress brought their meals without a second glance, treating them like any other family on a road trip, and that ordinary interaction felt more precious than any state dinner they had ever attended. The cottage appeared through the evening mist like something from a storybook, its stone walls covered in ivy and windows glowing warmly against the darkening sky. Catherine had chosen this place months ago during her secret house hunting trips, drawn to its isolation and the way it seemed to exist outside of time itself. No cameras could find them here. No protocols dictated their daily routines, and no one expected them to be anything other than a family seeking peace. The children tumbled out of the car with renewed energy, their earlier questions forgotten in the excitement of exploring their new temporary home. Charlotte discovered a tire swing hanging from an ancient oak tree, while George immediately began investigating the stone walls that bordered their property, already planning the adventures he would have in this mysterious new territory. William carried their suitcases to the front door, where the key waited exactly where the estate agent had promised it would be. The simple act of unlocking their own door without security checks or staff assistance felt revolutionary. Inside, the cottage embraced them with the smell of lavender and old wood, a sharp contrast to the sterile perfection of palace life. The previous owners had left behind a collection of children's books, board games, and a piano that had clearly been loved by generations of small hands. Catherine ran her fingers across the keys, producing a melody she remembered from her childhood, before royal duties had filled her days with obligations instead of simple pleasures. The sound echoed through rooms that didn't care about her title or her bloodline. That first evening, they cooked dinner together in the tiny kitchen, bumping into each other and laughing when the smoke alarm objected to William's enthusiastic approach to grilling vegetables. The children set the table with mismatched plates and argued over who got to light the candles, normal family chaos that had been impossible to achieve under the watchful eyes of palace staff. After dinner, they walked through the village as the sun set behind rolling hills that stretched endlessly in every direction. The local pub was busy with farmers and families, people who nodded politely but showed no signs of recognition or interest in their new neighbors. Catherine felt her shoulders relax for the first time in months. Tension she hadn't even realized. She was carrying finally beginning to dissolve. The village shopkeeper, a woman in her 70s with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, welcomed them warmly and offered to set aside fresh bread each morning if they'd like. She asked no questions about where they had come from or what had brought them to her quiet corner of the world, accepting their presence with the easy grace of someone who had learned that everyone carries their own stories. That night, the children fell asleep quickly in their new bedrooms, exhausted by travel and excitement. George declared his room perfectly adventurous because he could see the stars through his window, while Charlotte was delighted to discover that her bed was positioned perfectly for watching the sunrise each morning. Louis had already claimed the rocking horse in the corner as his own, riding it with the determination of a knight heading into battle. William and Catherine sat by the fireplace after the children were asleep, sharing a bottle of wine they had bought from the village. Shop and watching flames dance in the grate. For the first time in years, they talked about dreams instead of duties, about the books they wanted to read, and the places they wanted to explore with the children. The conversation felt rusty at first, like a language they had once spoken fluently, but had almost forgotten. The cottage had no grand ballrooms or state apartments, no portraits of ancestors watching their every move, and no schedules dictated by centuries of tradition. Instead, it offered something far more precious, the space to remember who they had been before the world decided who they should become. As the fire burned low and the countryside settled into peaceful silence around them, both William and Catherine began to understand that they weren't running away from their lives, but finally running toward them. The morning would bring new challenges and difficult conversations with the children about their changed circumstances, but tonight they were simply a family gathered around a warm fire, planning adventures and rediscovering the people they had been before duty had reshaped them into something else entirely. 3 weeks into their new life, the outside world finally caught up with them. Catherine was hanging laundry in the garden when she heard the familiar whir of helicopter blades cutting through the morning quiet. The children looked up from their game of hide-and-seek among the apple trees, their faces curious rather than alarmed, not yet understanding that the approaching aircraft represented everything their parents had tried to leave behind. William emerged from the cottage where he had been helping Louis build a blanket fort, his face immediately tense as he recognized the distinctive markings of the royal helicopter. The peaceful bubble they had created around their family was about to burst, and there was nowhere to run that wouldn't turn their escape into a spectacle for the entire world to witness. The helicopter landed in the field beyond their garden wall, and Catherine watched with a sinking heart as familiar figures emerged from the aircraft. Palace officials, security personnel, and her brother-in-law Harry, who had clearly been sent as the family representative least likely to be refused entry to their sanctuary. The sight of Harry's concerned face made her realize how dramatically their absence had affected everyone they had left behind. George and Charlotte pressed their faces against the window, fascinated by the unexpected visitors who had arrived like characters from one of their adventure stories. They had never seen their uncle look so serious, and their innocent questions about why everyone seemed upset cut through the morning air like accusations neither William nor Catherine was prepared to answer. The conversation in their small living room felt surreal, with palace officials in expensive suits sitting on their second-hand furniture discussing constitutional implications and public relations disasters, while Louis played with his toy cars at their feet. Harry spoke gently about the family's concern and the mounting pressure from Parliament, but his eyes kept drifting to his brother's face, searching for signs of the man he had grown up with. The headlines from the past 3 weeks were spread across their coffee table like evidence in a criminal trial. The Great Royal Escape, Where Are William and Kate, and A Crown Abandoned screamed from newspapers that had turned their search for peace into a national crisis. Catherine felt sick reading the speculation about their marriage, their mental health, and their fitness as parents, stories that had been written by people who had never met them but claimed to know their hearts. The children were sent outside to play while the adults discussed their impossible situation. Through the window, Catherine watched George teaching Charlotte how to skip stones in the small pond behind their cottage, their laughter a bitter contrast to the heavy negotiations happening inside. She realized that their attempt to give their children a normal childhood had instead thrust them into an even more abnormal situation. Harry explained that their departure had triggered a constitutional review and sparked debates about the future of the monarchy itself. Their private decision had become a public crisis, affecting not just their own family but the entire institution they had spent their lives serving. The weight of unintended consequences settled on Catherine's shoulders like a familiar burden she thought she had finally set down. William listened to the reports of public concern and parliamentary discussions with the stoic expression he had, perfected over years of official duties, but Catherine could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes. The man who had driven away from the palace seeking freedom was wrestling with the prince who had been raised to put duty above personal happiness, and neither version of himself had easy answers. The palace officials presented their proposed solution with the efficiency of diplomats diffusing an international incident. A gradual return to duties, modified schedules to accommodate their desire for privacy, and enhanced security measures that would allow them to maintain some of the normalcy they had discovered in the cottage. It sounded reasonable and civilized, but Catherine knew it was simply a prettier cage with slightly wider bars. As the afternoon wore on, the cottage that had felt like a haven began to feel like a courtroom where they were being tried for the crime of wanting to choose their own lives. The officials spoke about duty and tradition, about the millions of people who looked to the royal family for stability and continuity, about responsibilities that transcended personal desires. Every argument was familiar, and every argument was crushing in its logical weight. When evening finally fell and their visitors prepared to leave, Harry pulled his brother aside for a private conversation that lasted nearly an hour. Catherine couldn't hear their words, but she could see the pain in both their faces, two brothers trying to bridge a gap that had been created by circumstances neither of them had chosen, but both of them had to live with. The week following the palace officials' visit passed in a strange, suspended state, as if their cottage existed in a time bubble where decisions could be postponed indefinitely. Catherine spent hours walking the countryside paths, trying to find clarity in the rhythm of her footsteps and the endless expanse of green hills that seemed to stretch beyond all the complications of royal life. The children had begun to sense the change in their parents' moods, asking fewer questions about when they would return to their real home, but watching their faces more carefully during conversations. Charlotte had started hoarding small treasures from their cottage life, collecting smooth stones and pressed flowers in a shoebox she kept under her bed, as if she understood that these simple pleasures might soon become memories. William had grown increasingly quiet, spending long hours in the cottage's small study, staring out at the garden where he had taught Louis to ride a bicycle without training wheels. The joy of that accomplishment, achieved without photographers documenting every wobble and triumph, now felt bittersweet against the backdrop of their impossible situation. Freedom, they were learning, was more complicated than simply walking, away from obligations. One evening, as Catherine was reading bedtime stories to the children, she overheard William on a phone call with his father. The conversation was conducted in the careful, formal tones they had both mastered for difficult diplomatic situations, but she could hear the pain beneath the politeness. Duty and love were at war in her husband's voice, and she realized that her own heart was fighting the same battle. The village had begun to feel like home in ways that surprised them both. George had made friends with the farmers' children who lived down the lane, spending afternoons learning to milk cows and collect eggs with the enthusiasm of a city child discovering rural magic. Charlotte had convinced the village librarian to start a weekly story hour, creating a small community tradition that filled both of them with pride and purpose. But the outside world refused to be ignored indefinitely. Photographers had begun appearing at the edges of their property, long lenses pointed toward their windows like accusations. The village shopkeeper mentioned with tactful concern that journalists had been asking questions about her new customers. Their sanctuary was being invaded by degrees, each intrusion a reminder that privacy was a luxury they could borrow but never truly own. The hardest moment came when Louis asked why they couldn't invite Grandpa Charles to see his new favorite, Climbing Tree, his innocent question highlighting the bridges they had burned in their search for peace. Catherine realized that their children were paying a price for their parents' choices, missing grandparents, cousins, and the extended family network that had always been their security blanket. That night, after the children were asleep, William and Catherine sat in their garden under stars that seemed impossibly bright after years of London's light pollution. They talked honestly for the first time since leaving the palace, acknowledging the fear that had driven them away and the love that was calling them back. Their conversation lasted until dawn, covering dreams abandoned and responsibilities that couldn't be abandoned, the weight of tradition and the price of rebellion. Catherine found herself thinking about the thousands of letters they received. Each year, from people facing their own impossible choices, families torn between duty and desire, individuals struggling to balance personal happiness with obligations to others. She realized that their story had always been bigger than just their own lives, that their visibility carried responsibilities they couldn't simply set aside, even when those responsibilities felt suffocating. The decision, when it finally crystallized, felt both inevitable and heartbreaking. They would return, but on terms that honored both their need for family privacy and their commitment to public service. It wouldn't be the complete freedom they had tasted in the cottage, but it would be a compromise that allowed them to be both the parents they wanted to be and the public servants they had been raised to become. As they began the painful process of preparing to leave their temporary paradise, Catherine packed away the children's treasures and the memories they had created in their weeks of ordinary life. The cottage had taught them that happiness was possible, even within the constraints of duty, and that lesson was perhaps more valuable than the escape itself had been. The morning of their return dawned gray and drizzling, as if the weather understood the bittersweet nature of their departure from the cottage that had become more than a refuge. Catherine stood in each room one last time, memorizing the way. Morning light fell across the kitchen table where they had shared countless breakfast conversations, without the pressure of official schedules dictating their every moment. The children's excitement about seeing their grandparents and returning to familiar surroundings was tempered by genuine sadness at leaving behind the friends and freedoms they had discovered in the village. George carefully wrapped the fossil he had found in the stone wall, determined to show it to his grandfather, while Charlotte insisted on taking a cutting from the rose bush that had bloomed outside her bedroom window. William loaded their suitcases into the car with the same methodical precision he had used to pack them weeks earlier, but his movements now carried the weight of someone who understood that some journeys change you even when they bring you back to where you started. The cottage had shown them who they could be without titles and duties, and that knowledge would travel with them whether they wanted it to or not. The drive back to London was quieter than their escape had been, each mile feeling like a step back into a life that no longer fit quite the same way. The children dozed in the back seat, exhausted by the emotional weight of goodbyes to village friends who had accepted them without question or ceremony. Their innocence about the complexities of their situation was both a blessing and a burden. Their parents carried silently. As familiar landmarks began appearing outside their windows, Catherine felt the familiar tightness in her chest that had plagued her before their departure. But now it was accompanied by something new, a quiet strength that came from knowing they had choices, even if those choices came with impossible prices. The cottage had given them more than escape. It had given them perspective. The palace gates loomed ahead like the entrance to a different world, one where their private emotions would once again become public property and their family moments would be measured against centuries of precedent. But the compromise they had negotiated meant that some boundaries would be respected, some privacy protected, some normalcy preserved for their children's sake. The staff who greeted them moved with the careful efficiency of people who understood that this homecoming was more complicated than celebration. There were no photographers, no official statements, just the quiet return of a family who had learned that running away sometimes teaches you how to stay. Their absence had changed not just them, but the entire institution they served. That evening, as they tucked their children into beds that had remained exactly as they left them, Catherine and William both understood that they were not the same people who had departed weeks earlier. The cottage had stripped away the assumptions and expectations that had defined their lives, showing them that duty and happiness didn't have to be mutually exclusive if you were brave enough to redefine both. The changes they had negotiated were small but significant. More family time protected from official duties, reduced public appearances that allowed for genuine privacy, and the understanding that their children's childhoods would be guarded more fiercely than ever before. It wasn't the complete freedom they had tasted, but it was a bridge between the life they had fled and the life they were choosing to build. Months later, when people asked about their mysterious absence, the official explanations spoke of family, time and personal reflection, careful words that revealed nothing while saying everything. But in quiet moments, when Catherine caught William's eye across a crowded official function, or when they watched their children play in the palace gardens with the same joy they had discovered in the cottage, they shared the secret of their silent departure. They had learned that sometimes you have to leave everything behind to understand what's worth coming back for, that the heaviest farewells are often the ones that teach you how to say hello again. Their escape had lasted only weeks, but its lessons would shape the rest of their lives, a reminder that even fairy tale princes and princesses sometimes need to write their own endings. The cottage remained in their hearts as a symbol of possibility, A reminder that happiness was a choice they could make within any circumstances, and that the most profound journeys sometimes lead you back to where you started, but with eyes that finally know how to see.